welcome everyone to this Dialogue Book Club meeting. I am so excited to have Laurie Lee Hall here to talk about her new book, The Dictates of Conscience. My name is Caroline Klein. I am one of the new co-editors at Dialogue, and also a research assistant professor at Claremont Graduate University. So let's go around the Zoom room and introduce ourselves to Laurie and to each other. Ryan, you're next.
Hi, I'm Ryan Mullen. I teach chemical engineering in Central Illinois. I think we've been here for about 3 years and been coming to Dialogue Book Club about that length of time. Very excited to hear from Laurie.
Jana.
Hi, everybody. My name's Jana. I had the privilege of interviewing Laurie for Religion News Service, so it's great to see you again. Yeah, and I'm on the board of Dialogue.
Wonderful. And Peter.
Yeah, I'm Peter Ott. I'm just an attorney in the Salt Lake area. I've been a member of the book club since inception, and yep, enjoyed the book.
And I see that someone else has just joined. Lee, are you able to get on and very quickly introduce yourself to Laurie?
Yes, hi. I am Lee Anderson. I'm in Draper, Utah, and been doing these dialogue book clubs for a couple years now, and I'm never disappointed. And this was just a particularly eye-opening, and I know I loved it. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
I think that's all I see, Emily. Shout out if I'm missing anyone here, but we are so excited to have Laurie here. And Laurie, if you could take a few minutes and introduce yourself, maybe just give us a little bit of anything you want to share about your story, and then we will open it up to you book club members. This is your chance to talk to Laurie and ask her questions. So first I'll hand it over to Laurie.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful for the interest that you have all had and your colleagues who are part of the book club in Dictates of Conscience. It's been a marvelous thing to be able to share this story that I've lived. I'm assuming that everyone has read at least some, if not all, of the book at this point. And so I kind of humorously thought, how much more can I introduce myself than I've done in 310 pages? Other than to say that since the book has been published 6 months ago, that I've been really busy doing podcasts and promoting it and talking to people about it. And I think maybe I could share just one insight that's occurring. And that is, it was somewhat hinted at in the preface, as I wrote the preface towards the end of the manuscript writing. I began my telling of the story kind of with my heart in a place of, I need to describe really well my experience with gender identity and gender dysphoria, my positive experiences as a member and a leader and an employee of the church, and then the challenge when those two intersected and the things that happened, just describe factually the things that happened when all of that came to a head. But as the manuscript was being completed over the 2022 to 24 timeframe, it became more and more clear to me that I wasn't going to be just telling my experience at the intersection of Mormonism and transgenderism, but that the world, particularly the nation, was in need of a clear witness of the reality of gender identity and the validity of the words of those of us who experience gender dysphoria, and just to share that knowledge and witness, because it was becoming so critical in a dialogue that was both political and religious, that was contrary to my experience, my lived experience, and my existence. And I've told this before, that as we were wrapping up the manuscript, the church released on August 19th of last year its current restriction policies against transgender members of the church. So that stake had been stuck deep in the earth. And then I wrote my response to that in the afterword, and finished off the preface really feeling like the purpose of Dictates of Conscience was to face the maelstrom that seemed to be coming of both religious and political rhetoric against transgender persons. And between the time that we submitted the manuscript for publication and its actual publication date of November 20th, the 2024 presidential election took place. And its outcome was possibly the worst case scenario that I anticipated when I was writing the preface, hoping against hope that I wouldn't really feel prophetic about how badly this witness was going to be needed. And then we find ourselves on Inauguration Day, 2 months later, immediately through executive order being written out of the public square, that we just plain, in the eyes of the current federal government, don't exist. Many states piling on and feeling the same. So not in hindsight, but definitely in foresight, Dictates of Conscience became my witness against this moment in time in which we now live, wherein we need this voice and so many more voices to help others to understand the critical reality that is gender identity and gender dysphoria, before we can ever get to a point where folks in the political square, in the religious square, can accept what it's going to take to include us and allow us to be part of society in a peaceful and accepting and compassionate way. So that's kind of my introduction as to where I started and where we are now, and how passionate I feel about this now more than ever.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This book could not be more timely given what's going on in society in our country. So it was such a moving read. And to kick off the questions, can you tell us a little bit about the reception you've had, like to your book? Have people reached out to you, church members, non-church members, and have they been like, have they responded to your story in a way that shows that they have, they've been enlightened in some way? So I'd love to hear a little bit about how it's been received and the feedback you've gotten.
Yeah, it began, immediately once the book was released, and it seems like it continues, not so much on a daily basis now, but weekly and several times a month, that I'm hearing from a number of different categories of folk. Probably the highest number of people who are reaching out and sharing what they felt and learned about as they've read are moms of transgender individuals. particularly moms of transgender youth. That's a huge category of folk that just latched onto this story and said, I'm so grateful, for the explanation so that I can understand better what my child has experienced. I think my book is the book that my own mom wished she would have had, 50 years ago. I've been very interested in the written feedback that I've received from folks. There are so many who have resonated with just the struggle and the whole experience of developing courage and resilience necessary to overcome, in my case, the power structure in which I lived under, which was 24/7 the church, as an employee, as a priesthood officer, as a spouse and a parent to children, and all of that the church was the power structure. I've related to that now that I'm away from the church and no longer an employee and so forth, that in a larger sense, we all live currently under the umbrella of the federal government as a power structure. And is there a relatability in my tale as to how I faced with resilience and survived and now thrive, getting out from under the misunderstandings of the power structure I was under? And it's not any better, but I'm able to live free of that. I don't know how that relates to the bigger picture of living in the United States of America at this point. Another area of reader response that's been smaller has been those that have been just deeply interested in my experience working for the church and designing and building temples. That wasn't the purpose of the book, but I wanted to make sure that was in there to maybe be a carrot or a cookie, an Easter egg for those. And it is typically active members of the church who just really kind of enjoyed that part of the book, of the story. I've been really deeply touched by the way that individuals who face other challenges in their lives, who aren't transgender, who don't have a transgender family member, but maybe have experience in their life with disability or other challenges, how they've been able to follow my story and then adapt it to their own difficulty and challenges, and personalize it, really have made the story a light for themselves to follow in their own context. And that to me was profound and beyond my expectations.
Oh, that's beautiful. I will now step back and let all of you here who are on the Zoom have a chance to ask Laurie whatever questions you have.
Well, I'll go if no one else is jumping in. So Laurie, when we spoke for Religion News Service, it was actually the morning of Election Day. I don't know if you remember that.
It
Yeah.
was Election Day.
It was. And we both had, I think, a mixture of hope and dread at that time that turned quickly to dread and all of that. But you've addressed this a little bit already in your opening about how fast everything began happening with the new administration. As soon as the inauguration, the ink was barely dry. How has that affected you personally? I know you live in Kentucky. I don't know what the situation is like that legally, what the situation is in Kentucky legally now, but how are you doing, I guess?
Well, it's through a series of unfortunate events, my attempt at renewing my U.S. passport prior to the worst things happening got tied up in my application getting lost in the mail and sent to the wrong post office. I had a tracking number. My application for a renewed passport got sent to Doylestown, Pennsylvania, where it sat and languished when it was supposed to go to a Philadelphia, Pennsylvania post office, where the Department of State had the office that handles our area's passports. I watched that sit and languish through January, recognizing that from the time that I had submitted it to the time that they finally figured out that the application somehow was in Doylestown instead of in Philadelphia where it belonged, that the State Department had been instructed to revert all passports back to biological sex identified at birth. And despite the fact that I had a 10-year-old passport where my gender was accurately reflected as female, and I'd had that since the Obama administration, because it got lost in the mail, I got a passport back with a designation of male and a letter from the State Department that said, very kindly, we've changed your passport back to accurately represent who you are. Thank you very much, Marco Rubio and company. So there's one way, Jana, that it has impacted me directly. And I look back and I go, okay, why do things like this happen? Did this happen so that I can show the world that I can be resilient again and deal with the fact that I now have a document that reversed a very affirming identity? I'm watching carefully the ACLU and Lambda Legal take a broad court case through in which all of that gets turned over, and maybe sometime later this year or next, I'll be able to resubmit for my passport and get it corrected back to what it was supposed to have been. Meanwhile, I keep the old passport with the hole stamped in it and my new one banded together in my purse so that if I ever have to prove that, hey, this one says this, but this one says this, this is who I am. That's a minor thing, until I have to go back through TSA and, just have to out myself every time I open up that passport. Laws here in Kentucky haven't changed quickly. And I live in a relatively safe part of the state. And I applaud my two Republican senators on occasion when they stand up to the current administration. I love my Democratic governor who speaks out every chance he gets about what's going wrong these days. So Kentucky's not exactly the reddest of all places anymore, at least where I live. I have great concern for what's happening in schools, what schools are being forced to do up through the university level to kids who identify differently than their sex assigned at birth. I have continued angst over the restrictions the church put in place back in August that's causing, some of my friends who'd figured out what I wasn't allowed to figure out, and that was how to stay active in the LDS church, including holding callings as a transitioned member, which now is not allowed or available. How they're now leaving the church is just disappointing and so just damning to see what's happening to people for no good reason.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for sharing that, Laurie. And speaking of those changes from 2024 that were so devastating, I was, your book made me think so much, and I was trying to envision like what is the solution here within the church when it comes to transgender folks? And I was wondering if I could throw this out to you. And I ask this partially because I am a feminist, so I am very interested in issues of gender and how to best equitably welcome everyone, no matter who they are, no matter their sex, no matter their identity. How can we welcome everyone and honor and utilize all their gifts, no matter who they are? And so this is where this question is coming from that I have, which do you think, and tell me if none of these options are what you think is best, but is a good way forward or the best way forward to kind of get rid of all gendered things we have in the church, our gendered classes, our gendered teachings, our gender roles, which are so prominent within the church? Is that the way we become a community that just welcomes individuals as individuals and doesn't thrust them into gendered boxes? Or is that not the solution? Do you think it would be healthy and healing for transgender individuals to keep these gendered divisions and be welcomed in Relief Society and have women only spaces? I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we can best welcome and honor everyone in the church. Does it mean no more gendered stuff anymore?
Yeah, that's a kaleidoscope of questions,
I know.
that has really the ability to be answered in so many different ways. As a binary person, and when I look at gender, just being able to say, okay, I'm not XY, I'm XX. Speaking of genders, I'm female, not male. Therefore, gendered spaces work just fine for me. So I'm going to go to the female ones, just let that happen. But I'm only representative of one classification of how gender is experienced in life. There's so many others who, maybe would benefit. I don't know, that's a great dialogue to have, maybe would benefit from a genderless kind of situation. But at the same time, many of my conversations are with folks, Caroline, like yourself, that are feminists and have been so wonderful at welcoming me into feminist spaces. I can't comprehend of a situation where we wipe out all gender spaces and how that would look in a church that presently is very patriarchal. So are we ready to, if we're going to dump all the genderness of the church, are we also willing to, junk the whole, it's, male only priesthood? And, if we're all going to just become souls in the church, can any soul be a bishop or stake president or the prophet, or the teacher or the minister? It's that's a lot to imagine that happening. So in the meanwhile, I guess where I spend most of my time thinking about what would work in the church, it's still within that concept of we need to have gendered spaces because we need to have places where femininity can occur, where folks who are attracted to Relief Society can participate in Relief Society, drop all the silly barriers about sex assigned at birth, and just accept people for who they say they are. The whole church program, soup to nuts, top to bottom, works if you just accept who I say I am and just let me follow the path within the big plan, including all of its ordinances, and just let me receive them for me as me, who I am. And then the gendered spaces at least work for me. I'd be interested to talk to others who maybe are gender fluid or aren't identifying as either male or female, and what that would mean for them. But anyway, from my perspective, it's just, accept me as me, recognize that when it says, change the handbook to say, when we say gender is an essential characteristic of our eternal identity, good, accept that for what it is. Let us all tell you how we identify and who we've always been, regardless of our parts and so forth. And welcome us in and let us be ministered to, and let us minister according to who we are. That's the community I'd be happy to be a part of.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the complexity of that answer. Yeah, I too have mixed feelings about it myself, because I love Relief Society. I love being with women, and I would hate to have that gone. But on the other hand, I sure would love some of the constrictions, and I sure love women in leadership, more than they currently are, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I
Which
appreciate
I
that.
believe can occur.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I think I remember reading that in your book, that you were very open to women's ordination and
Yeah.
that.
And
Yeah.
all the more so now that the book has been printed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. So anyone else just kind of jump in if you have a question.
I have a question just about the process of writing a memoir like this about something that's so personal, right? And I know comparison is a dangerous thing. I couldn't help but compare reading this to reading Michael Quinn's memoir and diaries, or whatever you want to call that. So it's a different kind of book, right? He was dead when it was published, and I think he's a sharing kind of person. So he included stuff in that I would never want published that I had done, and you're a different person than he is probably a little bit more of a rule follower, it sounds like. But I guess in the process of writing the book, how did you decide how much detail to go into things like, for example, about your family relationships? I know there's complications with that. How did you decide this I want to share, this I want to keep private?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's, I shared more than I probably originally thought I would. I tried to share as openly as I could my recollection of things that happened a long time ago and how they affected me. And I think the thing I used to, particularly those things that occurred 50, 60 years ago, I tried to include those that would maybe share a little bit more of a light, shed a little light on how it affected me. And maybe as I was writing, it helped me to identify that, not that I just had this constellation of memories, but that there was an actual flow and process to those memories, which I tried to lay out in the book. That's kind of showed how I went from being a child to being a youth to being a young adult and so on. That went kind of A to B to C to D to E. And as those things happened, certain decisions were being made, certain things happened to me. It was probably more revealing to me to have that experience while writing it than it ever would be to anyone who would read it, because they didn't have my pre-author circumstance of just this constellation of all these memories and not really seeing how they worked and went together. Putting all of what I did choose to include together was to be extremely informative. I learned a lot about myself. I processed trauma that I had really murdered and put away and not realized I had. I've now come to admit that I have experienced many cases of memory suicide, particularly in my younger life, of things that I just put someplace where I would never have to experience them again. And writing brought them back out in ways that were quite amazing. So everyone who's read the book has got more now than I knew about myself in 2022. And so that's been a very revealing experience. But my little sister, who's mentioned in the book a lot, by the name of Debbie, not a real name, once challenged me and said, how can you write this stuff while mom and dad are still alive? And I think, yeah, that's a challenge, but those things had an imprint upon me that were valuable and important. But I had an older reader write back to me just recently how touched she was that my parents have been so accepting of me in their elderly years and in my adult life and the transition that I've taken. She saw the happy ending, if you will, of my family circumstance, that we still have a relationship that has actually been very affirming to me and is dear to me. So yeah, that at least one reader found that to be a good thing.
Yeah, no, thanks for sure.
Yeah. One thing I need to be transparent about is that the original draft manuscript, and any of you that are writers, maybe this is common, but the original draft manuscript was over 140,000 words. The book published at about 80,000 words. And I owe a great debt of gratitude to Barbara Jones Brown, my editor, who helped me get from 140,000 plus back to 80,000. She counseled me a lot on and coaxed me and chided me a lot about what things seemed meaningful and what she called my darlings, and that sometimes I needed to go murder my darlings and get them out of the text. We were also working very hard to take that very long, far too long story and really turn it into concentrated orange juice. Again, this is my first book. I have never considered myself a writer. If it's written well, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Barbara. But I think when I say we went from 140,000 words down to 80,000 words, folks don't need to worry that half of the stories were omitted. It just got a lot more concentrated as well. But as far as my work with the church, there were, of course, there were 20 years worth of experiences, much of which I remember very well and could tell stories about ad nauseum that didn't make it into the book, but I wanted to be able to show kind of a summary glance, if you will, at some of the kinds of experiences that I had, including with senior brethren. I had tons of experiences with people who are now gone and others who still lead the church. I thought sharing in detail how just before I came out as transgender, I worked for several years directly one-on-one with Boyd K. Packer, who wasn't anybody's LGBTQ favorite apostle. Those are the kinds of experiences that I had. I had the camaraderie and the love and respect of somebody who, just a month later had to go tell the first presidency I was transgender and needed to be released as a stake president after spending 4 years intimately designing a temple with him. There's some shock and awe to some of those stories, but there's also, it's like, if these happened, they weren't the only ones. But it's also, as you say, it's not the history of temple building, in the 21st century. It's just a sliver of that experience, and kind of to demonstrate that I just always had the idea that if folks reading it appreciated temples and what temples are and where they come from and what they mean, that folks would recognize that there was some pretty spiritual experiences associated with those projects. And there's always two ways to look at my story. Either I fell off the wagon and got off script in a huge way, or I actually was a sensitive and spiritually attuned individual who had this inner turmoil that I eventually did have to live and use the same spiritual tools that I did to work with the brethren in designing these temples to ultimately take charge of my own life and redesign myself. I've often said too in the past that you can look at my story in one of two different ways. One way is to say, I'm a guy who one day woke up and decided to be a girl. My story won't mean much to somebody who has that mindset. On the other hand, if you read Dictates of Conscience and you find that there's a person who has always been a girl, a young woman, and who was forced to present a certain way and do certain things contrary to her nature. And my gosh, look at the things she was able to do in that circumstance. And I think that if you can see that my transition was not changing who I was, but becoming more fully who I am, there's a lot to learn from this story. And I think that in many ways is the difference between those who are interested and sensitive to my journey versus those who dismiss it out of hand as, but it's harder to dismiss me out of hand if you simply say, wow, that person had all these marvelous experiences with the brethren and did all of these things in the church, but then all of a sudden went rogue and, went down the rabbit hole. I had an executive secretary during the years that I was stake president who was a dear friend and one of the most kind men I ever met, who just couldn't accept me post-transition. And he wrote to me once and said, and basically testified to me of all the amazing spiritual experiences we'd had as a stake presidency and attributing those to who I was and my leadership and so forth. But he was straining at the fact that I just somehow had turned my back on all of that to live an entirely different life. And it hurts so much to have him just not be able to appreciate the fact that this is me. That's who I was. That's who you enjoyed working with. I'm still here. Sorry, is book club always this emotional?
No. Oh, thank you. Oh, you're being so generous to be vulnerable like this. So we really appreciate you sharing this with us for sure.
That's why I wrote a book, though, so I wouldn't have to cry through these stories all the time.
Jump, and I do feel free, anyone else, to jump in, but maybe I'll insert a question really quickly. Bouncing off that a little bit, one of the things that did strike me about the book is the mix of reactions from Latter-day Saints after you came out in some way. And some people were rather loving and understanding. It sounded like Elder Uchtdorf was kind of loving, and you also, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name, but you had one friend that was like with you quite a bit and really stood by you quite a bit during various situations with your employers and with church authorities and so forth. And then of course there were these other people often in church authority that were just kind of rejecting and quite threatened. It seemed like there was a real sense of them, like your identity was threatening to them in some way. At least that's how it appeared to me as I was reading. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how you understand the variety of reactions, some so loving, some so threatened. And if you think, like, is there something that determines this fork in the road, as some people go down this path and some people go down this path in terms of either being loving or very much not loving? Is it a personality thing? Is it something about a person's individual values? Is it a particular understanding of the gospel that leads them in various directions? Just throwing that out. That might be a really hard question, but I was wondering a little bit about that.
Another kaleidoscope.
I know, I'm sorry.
I was actually kind of interested in the fact that there's 3 guys on this 9-member, including myself. That was actually one of the themes that we accidentally fell upon in the book, was that women in the church and outside the church are far more accepting of my story than, pardon me, brethren, men in the church seem to be. And it was, with the exception of just a couple of bishops and the friend that you mentioned, Elder Richard Heaton, it just seems that it almost divides on gender lines, that women found it a whole lot easier to embrace me and to welcoming me in, and men did feel threatened for the most part by the audacity of me giving all of that up, the patriarchy and the white male privilege and all of those dandy things that one finds in the church, to basically live in the second tier, with all the sisters. And I'm saying those kinds of things all terribly tongue-in-cheek for emphasis. So there's that going on, that it's very markedly women versus men in terms of level of acceptance, with exceptions. I think, and this is true even in this culture, I think it's true in other cultures that were machismo, where I served my mission in Argentina, will be even more the case, that transitioning in Latin America, I just can't imagine how difficult that could be. I'm rambling now, pardon me. Again, it kind of goes back, though, Caroline, to what I said earlier about what are your base assumptions about my circumstances. If individuals saw me and believed I was male all along, like some of my own kids, knew me as daddy, it's been harder for them than certainly it is for Nancy's kids, who are all grew up in the church as well and are the same ages and so forth. They never knew me as daddy, and so they accept me as a stepmom in ways that my own kids, just haven't gotten there because of what they knew me to be. I think a lot of people who knew me as their bishop or their stake president put an undue amount of trust in who I was because of my callings, and I think that's a problem in the church anyway, that folks get to rely on their priesthood leaders I think, more than they ought to in terms of being able to set that person between themselves and God. But I did have a marvelous experience with a woman who was in my ward, was a close neighbor when I was the bishop, and she recently crossed paths with me again and lives in Tennessee, and we got together and spent some time talking. And after about 5 hours of me sharing stories and dialoguing back and forth about things, she looked at me and she said, "Wow, I just realized you were always Laurie Lee. You have always been a woman." And for her, the dark scales of unbelief had fallen from her eyes, and it didn't matter what she thought or felt about me. In the past, she could feel my woman's heart. She could feel who I was now and realize that's who she's always known. And experiences like that, caused me to realize that there's nothing better than getting together one-on-one with somebody. And once you get to know somebody, it's really hard to not appreciate their story, which is why we need to have 10,000 such stories out there. If we all told our stories, maybe there'd be more understanding. I just came back, as I mentioned to you, from a family wedding this weekend, and it wasn't my family, it was Nancy's family. And most of the people there I'd never met before. But as we sat down and started to converse and talk and so forth, there were individuals there who just were like drawn to listening to my experiences. And because of that one-on-one experience, they're now interested in a topic that they hadn't been thinking about. And that's what I kind of hope will happen with Dictates of Conscience and a whole lot of other books and stories being told, is that it will get in front of eyes of people who aren't thinking about these things. I'm really excited that Mormon feminists and LGBTQ people, both near and far, all want to read it and get a lot out of it. But I really hope it gets in front of folks who, just never thought about this before, so that they can maybe comprehend that, wow, this thing called gender identity, this is real. And these folks deserve to have a place in our society.
I wanted to jump in here, just thinking about what you said with 10,000 people telling their story. I don't think I told you this, but I never really thought about gender identity issues until about 8 or 9 years ago. I wouldn't say that I was in any way opposed or anything. I just never had reason to think about it until an organization that I was reviewing books for sent me a book that on audio called Being Jazz. And it's by, okay, you know this book. So it's by a young woman who was a YouTube star, and she wrote the book when she was still maybe 16 or 17 years old. And I had never heard of her before, like teenagers on YouTube, not my target demographic, right? So
Right.
this is not a book that I ever would have picked up to read. And I was listening to this story about how, this person who now goes by Jasmine, but I think was born as Jaren or Jared or something like that. And describing being still in a onesie, and so maybe 1.5 years old or something, and going around the house having unsnapped the onesie so it would be a dress.
At the West.
A dress, yeah. And I just about drove off the road, hearing just that detail of the memoir of this person, this totally particular, but also very universal story of knowing who she was, even at that age, that she wanted to be perceived a certain way because she knew she was a girl. That book, I would say, really changed my thinking. Or at least it caused me to think, about something that I hadn't ever had to before. So thank you for telling your story. It's a long way of saying it, but.
Right. Thank you, Jana. One of the things that became evident, and I think I spelled this out in the early part of the memoir, was that I realized, looking back at my memories, that as a child, I did want to be seen as a girl. Then suddenly, as a youth, that was the last thing I wanted people to see about me. I wanted to hide that. But it's interesting, the innocence of a child that just, wants to say, it's me. Look how cute I am. And then suddenly it's like, no, that you're going to hurt me. I'm going to hide this. Um, that was a very real thing. And I never put it in such simple language before. There's a underlying theme there that you're picking up on, Derek, that I knew was there. I was consciously putting this in place, trying to describe the fact that I went from being a very blindly obedient, faithful, young bishop to, by the time I was partway into my stake presidency, I had really experienced firsthand the phrase that familiarity breeds contempt. And that's perhaps a little blunt, but I had so many priesthood leader experiences and church employee experiences with the upper echelons of the church that I had really developed in my mind and my heart. And I think I tried to portray this, the fact that I realized that we were all just people trying to do our best, and that my most important relationship on things like this of major importance to me personally had to be between myself and God, and that I didn't need any intermediaries to talk to about such things. To some degree, that attempt at coming out to my poor bishop was one of the baby steps of coming to realize that now this isn't something that I'm going to be able to work through normal priesthood channels with. This is something I'm going to have to follow use the phrase dictates of conscience. But then I think I go right into the story from that interview with the bishop in 2007 to dealing with Proposition 8 as a stake president. And I think that's not by chance, other than the fact, I mean, they really were almost concurrent experiences, but it was to demonstrate that, when I faced what church leaders were telling me at that point as my divine duty as a stake president to go and to support this directive, that it was like, ain't no way that I'm going to ever let anybody think that I support this. They will never hear from me about it. As a way of kind of showing, long before I brought the reader into this circumstance of, I've got gender identity issues that I really have to deal with as an adult, I was already making that transition to being someone who followed my conscience, my heart, in what I felt were the ways that God wanted things to be done, either in my life or in the lives of the people that I'd been commissioned to support. Does that kind of help flesh that out?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ryan, did you want to get in there with one last question before we close this down?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a member of another book club as well that meets in person. And we're wrapping up our set of books that we've selected. And so we're going to be suggesting new books. I'm the only one in that circle with an LDS background. And I'm worried that they will certainly appreciate your story about coming out and transitioning. I just don't think they'll get the LDS part. And I'm just curious if you've heard from any people without a Latter-day Saint background talk about it, and if that was difficult for them to grasp, or if, I don't know, if you've had any response from.
I've done a few podcasts and intentionally have been trying since the first of the year to talk with individuals outside of Mormondom, because, you know, I had absolutely expected that people with an LDS background would have some interest in the book for one reason or another, but I really wanted to see if it could be successfully pushed and read outside of the Green Jello Belt. Barbara and I spent a lot of time working on terminology in the book and trying to make it readable for a non-LDS audience. Lots of LDS topics in there, and you know, but honestly, I think we did a fair job of making it readable for someone who doesn't have that LDS background. You know, and as I talk about the application of coming out from under power structures that are dominant in our lives, I think that's universal enough that non-LDS folk could get into that. I think certainly anyone who has been part of a high demand religion, not LDS, could find interest in that. But I think it also has application to other circumstances where, you know, I think I talked with Cynthia Winwood and Susan Hinckley on my broadcast with them about the fact that, you know, it's really about claiming your truth and having the resilience, the courage, the capacity to step out and live according to what, you know, you're feeling in your head and your heart. And these universal themes, I think, should be successful enough to interest readers outside of Mormondom. And I would hope that that would be the case. You know, if you could pitch that idea successfully to them, I'd love to hear how that goes. But I really think there's larger application than just Mormonism within and within the intersection of lesbians and gays and transgender folk and Mormonism. I really think there's some universal themes there that are really meaningful if people give my story a chance.
I certainly appreciated your comments from the very beginning about coming out from under power structure. I think that is certainly applicable and that will resonate with a lot of people. So I'll make the pitch and hopefully it'll get picked up. So thank you very much.
Yeah, let me know. I love feedback, and if for anyone that reads the book, I'd love to hear what you found in it that resonated with you, because it's meaningful to me, and encourages me to, you know, as I continue to try to tell my story beyond what I've written, to be able to tell it in ways that, you know, that do touch hearts and change lives.
Oh, well, Laurie, I think all of our experience here is definitely that you have done exactly that. It was such a moving read, and you're so wonderfully vulnerable, both in the book, but also here. I think I got a much fuller sense of just who you are as a person, just speaking with you tonight. So thank you for coming here tonight and participating in this book club. It was a wonderful experience for me.
Thank you all. Again, I really am so grateful that you made Dictates of Conscience a moment of your study. It was great.
Oh, it's been a privilege to talk to you, a privilege to hear your story. So, everyone, thank you so much. So we will reconvene in another 3 months or so. Next time around, it is going to be John Turner's new biography on Joseph Smith. So that'll be interesting to see what insights he brings. All right. Thank you. And we'll see you next time.
Good night.
Greetings, my name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.